What position should you draft first in fantasy football this year? Where are the pockets of value at running back and wide receiver? When should you get your quarterback and your tight end? We're smack dab in the middle of draft season right now, and that means you need to get ready. Fortunately, we're here to help you do just that with an all new episode of the Draft Sharks podcast right now. Matt Schauf and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here with your fantasy football draft strategy guide. We are past the midway point of August at this point. If your draft has not already happened, then it's about to. And that means it's time to set your plan. It's time to sync your league at DraftSharks.com. You get your draft war room set. You run your final few mock drafts. You get familiar with that ADP and where you would like to target certain positions, even specific players. That, though, Jared, is not to say that we want to set a rigid plan that we have to draft by, right? We're talking about working all of your draft muscles in advance of draft day so that when you're in the real thing, when things start happening that you didn't know were going to happen that way, you can react appropriately because you've already seen all these scenarios.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it's important to have like a general understanding of the draft landscape. And like you said, Matt, like where the pockets of value are at positions, the kind of priority players you want to have that you want to target and make sure you get on your team. But if you've done more than one fantasy draft in your life, you know that these things just don't go as planned. ADP is only a guideline and never goes exactly, straight down the list. So you need to be able to be flexible. And again, I think the more practice you do with the mock draft trainer, the more content you consume, the more you kind of just study your league and its rules, that the more prepared you're going to be to kind of be nimble and adjust on the fly throughout your draft.
Exactly. And today's show is about helping you with that plan, not so that you can stick to it rigidly, so that you're ready for whatever happens in your draft. We're going to be going position by position. We're going to talk about when we're targeting each position as we do our own drafts, how we're building rosters this specific draft season, and even some particular targets at each position to help you with that build. You can find much more info, of course, strategy specifics, and differing plans by format on DraftSharks.com right now. We've got draft guide articles for a number of formats. Whatever you're playing, you can find help for it there. Jared, let's kick off this draft guide episode with quarterback. And first off, when do you like to target that position in drafts this year?
Yeah, for me at quarterback this year, it's the Ricky Bobby strategy, right? You either want to be first or last. You want to be one of the first teams to take a quarterback, one of the last teams.
Shake and bake.
Shake and bake, baby. We've talked about the elite quarterbacks and how, oftentimes they're coming at value. That remains the case for us. And we've seen them climb an ADP the deeper we've gotten to draft season. I think, more of the casual leagues, you're maybe going to see quarterbacks go earlier. But to me, these elite quarterbacks, and when I say elite quarterbacks, I'm talking Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jaden Daniels, Jalen Hurts. I do not include Joe Burrow in there. He's kind of in his own tier. He's a strong quarterback, but not an elite quarterback to me. Any of those top four, though, if I can get them in the back half of round 3 or really anywhere in round 4, I'm open to doing that. For starters, those quarterbacks are just super safe. They are not going to bust if they don't get hurt. They have long track records of production outside of Jaden Daniels, but I feel good about him at least being as good, if not taking a step forward in year 2. And there's obviously upside to all those guys to lead the position in fantasy points, to be weekly and season-long difference maker. So that's nice. And then at the same time, for me, at running back and wide receiver, the late 3rd round and really throughout the 4th round, it's kind of a shaky range for both those positions, especially wide receiver for me. So that's why, I think the opportunity cost to take one of those elite quarterbacks becomes less as you get into, the back half of round 3 and round 4.
I agree. And we'll talk about the specifics of running back and wide receiver in those ranges as we get to those positions. But that late round 3 portion is where I'm considering quarterback. And then especially in round 4 is my usual first step. And that's because Jalen Hurts has been my top target among these elites. We've talked about it on multiple shows at this point, but Jalen Hurts is basically just the best value among that top 4. And there's not a whole lot separating Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels, Jalen Hurts, other than ADP. You can commonly get Jalen Hurts late in round 4, which means wherever you're picking in round 4, he can be an option for you. A round and 2 rounds beyond that, I'm certainly willing to look at Joe Burrow. I'm willing to look at Patrick Mahomes because we've talked about those two guys. We saw last year that Joe Burrow can finish among the elites. I know you just talked about him not being in the elites in our rankings. Not that we don't believe he has that elite potential. just without as much rushing, he needs to do more passing to get there. So it's a little bit difficult. It's a little bit more difficult for him to get there. So that's why he's behind that top group, certainly capable of scoring up in that range. And Patrick Mahomes also still capable of scoring up in that range. We just haven't seen it from him in longer than we last saw it for Joe Burrow and the other guys. So Jalen Hurts kind of that first point for me. If I don't get him for whatever reason, I'm willing to look at Joe Burrow the next round, Patrick Mahomes the round beyond that. But there's no point at which I feel like I need to draft a quarterback. There's no time in my draft where I'm like, I have to take a guy now or I'm going to be screwed and I'm going to lose this league. The key to that is figuring out the exact players that match up value-wise, because I don't really like Bo Nix. I don't like Baker Mayfield. I don't really like Kyler Murray this year. And those are those guys that are right behind the ones that we just talked about. But Justin Fields is kind of that next major step for me where I think that he's going later than he should. And I think part of that is the negativity coming out about the Jets offense. And normally, if you're hearing reports about the quarterback not looking great and the offense not running great, that would be reason to worry about a quarterback. I don't care for Justin Fields, though, because he's not going to get benched. And if the offense isn't going well, Justin Fields' passing isn't going great, he's still going to get us there with the rushing. So I hope that the negativity stays there and that keeps Fields' ADP down, especially as we get into more single leagues where people are like, I can't screw this team up. I'll be sitting there waiting to catch Justin Fields in those situations.
And I've already noticed Fields' ADP dropping. If you look at our ADP consensus right now, he's quarterback 13 in consensus ADP. That's a spot or two lower than he was even a couple of weeks ago. So, yeah, I mean, Fields is a big part of my quarterback plan. Again, if I don't get one of the elites, and again, I'm willing to deviate, right? Like if Burrow gets to round 6 or Mahomes gets to round 8, like I'll consider that. But for me, if I don't get one of those elites, I want to be the last team to take a quarterback. These quarterbacks are all sitting outside the top 12 in our consensus ADP. Justin Fields at quarterback 13, a 10th round ADP. Caleb Williams, quarterback 14, also in round 10. Drake May at quarterback 16 in the 11th round. And Trevor Lawrence still at quarterback 20 in round 13. All outside the top 12. So theoretically, again, you could let every other team in your league take a quarterback. And then to me, if I don't get an elite, I want 2 of those 4 guys. I want to take, a Fields in round 10, pair him with a Trevor Lawrence in round 13. I think worst case, you're playing matchups with those guys throughout the season. Best case, one of them just emerges as a top 10 fantasy quarterback that you're starting every week and you don't have to worry about it. So again, that's why those mid-tier quarterbacks, they might look tempting at points in your draft. But when you do enough of these drafts and you get to around like 12 and May and Lawrence are still sitting there, you feel kind of dumb for taking even a Patrick Mahomes in round 7. Because I do think those other guys are going to put up similar production even to someone like Mahomes.
Yeah, Dak Prescott has climbed since we talked about how much we liked him early in draft season, but there's still some fluidity in the way these quarterbacks will go in an individual draft. So you might see him fall as well. Jordan Love just returned from his thumb injury to practice today. We're recording this on Monday, so he's in that mix as well. I think even CJ Stroud is going to wind up proving a lot more usable fantasy-wise than he looks like by ADP right now. Just a couple of years ago, he was performing like a top 10 fantasy quarterback. So there are lots of guys in there. I agree with you. I think if you don't get like a top 6 quarterback on my board, you want to go ahead and get 2 of those guys for insurance, for platoon purposes, whatever the case. The smaller that first bet you're making on quarterback, the more sense it makes to insure that bet so that your team is in good shape going forwards. Let's move on to Superflex now for anybody who's doing a Superflex draft. We're not going to get too far into it. We have talked specifically about drafting for Superflex this year, but just a real quick hitter on it, Jared. If I'm in a Superflex draft, if I get any of the top 6 quarterbacks, from Lamar Jackson down to Patrick Mahomes in our rankings, I'm taking that guy wherever he gets to me in round 1. Otherwise, I'm looking at another position, then coming back for quarterback in round 2, maybe even round 3.
Yeah, similar for me. I would include Mahomes in there. I don't know. I've gotten a bit lower on Mahomes with the Rashee Rice stuff. He might miss half the season. I've come down a bit on Mahomes. But if you look at our Superflex rankings, the top 5 overall are quarterbacks. The 4 elites we talked about plus Joe Burrow. So I'm with you there, Matt. Top 5 pick, I'm taking a quarterback. Really, though, my Superflex strategy at quarterback is the same strategy as in one quarterback, just pushed up multiple rounds. Like I'm willing to take those elite quarterbacks in the top half of round 1. But if I don't get them, if I'm picking 111 or 112 in a 12-team Superflex, I'm willing to push off the position until, round 4, 5, 6 and take 2, ideally 3 of those, quote unquote, quarterback 2s, the Drake Mays, the Trevor Lawrence, JJ McCarthy. I'll take 2 or 3 of those guys load up elsewhere, and I think I'll still be okay at quarterback.
And then the guys that aren't really going to be one quarterback factors, I don't expect, but that will be in a super flex league: Bryce Young, Geno Smith, the Rams duo. We just saw Matthew Stafford return to practice today, but even if he has back issues, you can insure him with Jimmy Garoppolo. Probably not going to get exactly the same production, but I think you'll get fine super flex production from Garoppolo if he has to step in. Cam Ward's going late. The Giants duo at quarterback, you can pair Russell Wilson and Jackson Dart on the same roster. So I think all those guys are also players that can allow you to wait to get that second quarterback, especially in Superflex, as long as you make sure in that case to secure a third one.
Yeah, I'll throw the Colts duo in there too. Draft Anthony Richardson and Daniel Jones. I think those guys, both have a chance to be. Jones could be a lower end quarterback one when he's out there. Richardson, we know, could be a top 6 option just because of the rushing. So I think that's another pair you could take late in Superflex drafts.
Jared, before we get deep into running back and how we're playing it, what's changing on the running back landscape?
I did all this research into league-wide trends early in the offseason. I never got around to turning it into an article, but if you are listening to our podcast or watching us on YouTube here, you are going to get some of those goods. So, yeah, the rushing stuff is interesting. League-wide rushing rate has been on the rise. And last year, teams as a whole, league-wide, ran 43.4% of the time. That was the highest rate in 9 years. On top of that, running back efficiency was also up last year, both in terms of yards per carry, touchdown rate, receiving stuff across the board, yards per catch rate, all that stuff was up the board for running back efficiency. So as a result, top 50 running backs last year scored the most PPR points they've scored as a group since 2019. And if you look at where that increase came, it came in RBs 2 through 28. So in other words, RBs 2 through 28 last year, that entire group scored more points last year than it had averaged over the previous 5 years. On the other hand, RBs 29 through 50 all scored fewer points than they had on average. So running backs as a whole scored more points, but that increase came at the top, right? Like the RB1s, the RB2s into RB3 territory. I think some of that had to do with the fact that the position just stayed healthier last year than usual. We had the big seasons out of Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, these guys on the older side, but they stayed healthy and produced. I think the injury rate was just lower at the position. But I do think there's something to maybe the position getting a bit more condensed than it has been, where we have, more of these higher end running backs accounting for more of the total production at the position.
Yeah, we saw teams invest in those lead running backs, Derrick Henry to the Ravens, Philly picking up Saquon Barkley. We saw, more money pumped into older running backs than we had seen in recent years. And it makes sense if teams are paying those guys to give them the ball more. And if they're staying healthy, then it's going to leave less available for, their backups, the team's third running backs, to do that scoring. So I think all of that put together makes sense for why scoring went that way. Is that changing how you're approaching running back this season?
A little bit. I think I'm more willing to take those high-end guys. My general running back plan this season is I like to have one running back through the first 4 rounds with no more than 2. And then I do like to have my second running back through round 6. We can get into some of these targets, but to me, round 6 is kind of the cutoff for like guys that I'm comfortable likely being every week starters this season. To me, I think once you get into round 7 this year, you're talking more like pure committee members that are going to be potentially shaky week to week starters, and then like handcuff types. So I think that again speaks to this league wide trend we've seen where their points are kind of getting pushed up more towards the top. And I want to make sure I get, again, at least 2 of those, like, say top 28 type running backs.
Yeah, running back versus wide receiver early in my draft really depends on the specific format and the specific players who reach me. So do I start 2 wideouts versus 3, PPR, half PPR, non-PPR, any other specs that affect the scoring and affect how I'm going to want to build my lineup every week? That's going to impact whether I'm taking running back, wide receiver at a specific spot. There are, running backs that I like in round 1: Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, Christian McCaffrey, Ashton Genty. Barkley is not generally a guy that I'm taking at cost because I'm taking Bijan ahead of him. And obviously they're going, back to back most likely. So really, Robinson, McCaffrey, Genty are the 3 running backs that I'm looking at in round 1. We'll talk about the receivers in a minute, but that's still more wide receivers in round 1. So I'm with you. I want to get an early running back. It's generally one in either round 1 or round 2, but I'm not going to force myself to get a running back in one of those 2 rounds. It ties back into what you're saying, though. We want to get one of those workhorses if that's the way the league is going. If it's relying heavily on these workhorse running backs, we want to go ahead and take advantage of that, unless we want to build in another specific way that goes against that because we're trying to go against the grain for the purpose of going against the grain. But we can talk about that in a minute. I'm also a little bit less attracted to the round two running back. So that can actually play into whether I go running back, like specifically if I'm looking at
Mhm.
McCaffrey versus the wide receivers in the second half of round one. It's easier for me to lean toward McCaffrey there because I know that I don't like the round two running backs as much, and I do like the wide receivers in that round. And even over the next few rounds, I think there are going to be more spots where I like the receivers and like what I can collect at that spot than if I have to do the same thing at running back.
Yeah, agree on all those points. I think too, obviously how you attack running back early on depends on where you're picking it, in the draft, right? So I kind of broke it down this way. And again, all these scenarios are going to get you one running back through the first 4 rounds and ideally two through the first six. But so if I'm picking early in round one, I'm planning on either taking Bijan in round one or some combination of Jonathan Taylor and Chase Brown in rounds 2 and 3. I think you want to come out of the first 3 rounds with at least one of those guys, whether it's Bijan in round one, probably JT in round two. At this point, Chase Brown, you probably got to take him in round two to make sure you get him. He doesn't often get to round three, but he's a great target in round three if he gets there. So that's kind of the early picks in round one. If I'm picking in the middle, I'm kind of prioritizing Christian McCaffrey at this point, assuming like Jamar Chase, Bijan, Saquon, and CeeDee Lamb are off the board. Like it's kind of CMC for me. Jonathan Taylor is an option in round two if you're picking in the middle. And then for me, kind of the next spot to target a running back from the middle of the draft is Kenneth Walker or James Conner in round four. So that's kind of how you can get to one or two running backs from the middle. And then picking late in round one, like you said, Matt, Devon Achane and I think Ashton Genty kind of at the 1-2 turn are good picks. And then Alvin Kamara and Ken Walker at the 3-4. So I think mixing in, one or two of those guys at the turn kind of sets you up in a good spot at running back.
Yeah, I like all those guys, and there are quality options available at running back in round 3, 4, 5, but it gets a bit more sparse where if a specific guy doesn't get to you, then it's like, I don't really want to reach for the next running back on my list. I'd rather
Yep.
take wide receiver here. So that's where you kind of go back to, should I take a running back in this spot so that I don't feel like I need to take one here, or so that I'm not weak later and have to collect guys. That said, if you do start wide receiver heavy and then you get into that range, I would still avoid reaching for a running back that you don't like just because you feel like you need one. I'm okay with a roster that starts out with like a lethal combo of wide receivers and Jalen Hurts through 3 or 4 rounds, and then has starters like Isaiah Pacheco, Jalen Warren, Tyrone Tracy at running back. Obviously, those are not your ideal running back combos, but the trade-off for that is that you have this potentially high-level wide receiver core, stud quarterback, and then you can kind of piece together running back. And I think if you do get into that range, that's when you want to make sure to just spend several consecutive picks on running backs. Don't say, oh, I got Isaiah Pacheco and I love him this year. He's definitely going to pay off. Take him, take Jalen Warren, take Tyrone Tracy, take Quinshon Judkins now that he's back, grab some Jacksonville running backs. Just, get these guys that are in unclear situations that could work out for you. And then all you really need to do is bet on 2 to 3 of them being usable week to week.
Yeah, and to me, that's like the later round strategy at running back, regardless. I think running back is the position you want to be taking your bench upside shots on, because we know that's a position where, for a lot of these guys, it just takes one injury, and all of a sudden they're producing almost to the level, if not at the level the starter was ahead of them. So, yeah, definitely want to stash these guys. I think, again, I said round 6 is kind of the last spot to get like a safe weekly starter, and I generally want to have 2 running backs by the end of round 6. Those round 6 guys to me are Isaiah Pacheco. He's been a favorite of ours all offseason, still is. He caught a ball in the Chiefs' second preseason game and looked healthier on that catch than he did at any point last year after coming back from his broken leg. So that was nice to see. Then the other round 6 running back is Tony Pollard. I've been talking up Tyjae Spears a lot this offseason, and I still think he's a nice stash, but high ankle sprain for Tyjae Spears in week 1 of the preseason, that's going to, potentially cost him the start of the season and probably even linger, throughout September. So if nothing else, Tony Pollard has a chance to get off to a nice start and be a solid weekly starter early in the season. So I like Tony Pollard in round 6. And then, like you said, Matt, I think Jalen Warren and Jordan Mason are 2 guys in round 8 and 9 you can target. And I think, to me, round 8, 9 is kind of, I like to have like 3 running backs at that point, because when you get past that tier, it is like these stashes that are not going to be guys you can count on early in the season. And again, you want to be stashing a lot of those guys, the Tyjae Spears, the Braylon Allens, the Ray Davis, the Tyler Algiers, those types you want to be stashing, but obviously they're not going to be startable early on. So I do like to have, I'd say 3 running backs by round 9 is a good general rule of thumb that I'm trying to get to in most of my drafts.
And because you mentioned a couple of handcuff level running backs there, I think it's worth mentioning that Overall, fantasy drafters have gotten smarter in the handcuff running back area in realizing that you're necessarily losing value if, your starter goes down and you have to put in his backup in that place. You're losing value in your starting lineup. Now, I think that there are definitely also spots where we have overcorrected in that area. If you're trying to win a large field tournament, you don't really want to get somebody's like a handcuff to a guy that you're starting, because you're already in a bad way if your stud running back goes down and you're not really making up that value by playing his handcuff. In a single league, though, you can absolutely take Tony Pollard in round 6 and then Tajay Spears in round 10. And you can start Tony Pollard for as long as he's healthy. And if he goes down, you can stick Tajay Spears in there and probably get just as much production, maybe even more, because I think Spears has been a better a better receiving back than Tony Pollard has to this point in their respective careers. So I think that's a spot where you can go ahead and handcuff your guy. I think there are a couple of other spots. Like if you do take Breece Hall, I think Braylon Allen makes sense as a handcuff as long as you don't have to do it too early. But just in general, I would say handcuff is not something that you want to necessarily target no matter who your starter is, but don't be scared of the handcuff for specific running backs where it makes sense.
Totally agree. And your, home league where you're trying to beat out 9 or 11 other teams, like you don't need the super team to win. So handcuffing makes a lot more sense in that format than it does in tournaments. And I think, price definitely matters too. I think that the Spears and Pollard example is perfect, where if you're spending a 6th round pick and a 12th round pick to get Tennessee starting running back, that makes sense. something like, and man, Seattle's running game has looked so good. I hate to use this example, but Ken Walker plus Zach Charbonnet, at this point, that's going to potentially cost you like a 3rd round pick and an 8th round pick. That's kind of pricey. That is at a point where you are probably limiting your upside even in a home league, because you're spending 2 picks on guys that in the first 8 rounds they probably can't produce together. So again, just be aware of the price on the handcuff versus the starter, and be aware of the backfield in general. Is it a backfield we're excited about? In that case, it's more enticing to potentially take the handcuff.
Yeah, if the offense sucks, then you don't want to be like, oh, I'm definitely going to have that whole running back position on my roster. So, wide receiver, Jared, what's the trend look like there? We just talked about rushing picking up. I assume it's been a more negative trend for the wide receivers.
Yeah, you nailed it, Matt. Wide receiver scoring has been down actually the last 4 years now compared to the previous 3. And last year, if we look at wide receivers 1 through 70 total points, second fewest total points by those top 70 wide receivers over the last 7 seasons now. And then just digging down into where this production is coming from. Again, the exact opposite of running backs. Wide receivers 2 through 28 last year all scored fewer points than they had over the previous 5 seasons. But wide receivers 29 through 43, so the wide receiver 3 and 4 range, those guys all scored more fantasy points. So again, that speaks to, I think, teams just getting more wide receivers on the field and maybe spreading the ball around a bit more than they had over the previous few years.
We did have some wide receiver injuries last year that helped with that a bit, but it's all worth being aware of. And I guess my takeaway, obviously, we're all kind of collectively changing how we're drafting running backs and wide receivers early based on how last year went. I would say watch for spots where people change too much. I think about Jahmyr Gibbs going in round 1 specifically because he's the running back in round 1 that I think is the riskiest, just in terms of the amount of work he gets. Every other running back in that round has been or is expected to be a workhorse this year. Jahmyr Gibbs doesn't fit that. So I would say that's part of me being wary of taking Jahmyr Gibbs over a wide receiver where I'm sure that wide receiver is going to dominate his team in targets. Malik Neighbors for the Giants, who we'll talk about in a minute. But, that's where I want to not overcorrect for last year's rushing pickup and make sure that I still am giving as much attention to the wide receivers going in that range.
Yeah, and I don't have the exact ADP numbers in front of me, but I am certain that running backs in general are going higher in the early rounds than they did last year. Again, that's just a reaction to the result of last year where we had these running backs stay healthy. We had the huge seasons out of multiple running backs. So, drafters are reacting to that, whether it's right or not, I'm not sure, but I think there's potentially an advantage to be gained to kind of, zagging where everyone else is zigging and maybe, again, going wide receiver heavier in drafts this year, because it is possible to, build a stronger trio of wide receivers now than it was the past couple of years, just because those receivers have been pushed down in ADP a little bit.
We mentioned liking Christian McCaffrey in the middle of round 1, but I also still like more wide receivers in round 1 than I do running backs. So if I don't line up with getting one of those running backs, I'm probably going wide receiver. And in particular, Puka Nacua, Nico Collins, Brian Thomas Jr., Malik Neighbors are all guys that can slide to the back half of round one, which has been a really comfortable spot to draft from for me this year so far, Jared, because you can get to that, 10, 11, 12 spot in a 12 team league. You can take McCaffrey if he falls to there. You can consider Genty if he's still around, or you can take two of these high level wide receivers. And that room for flexibility really makes it a better draft position as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, the back half's been nice for a lot of the year. I say it's gotten a little trickier lately with the Matt
Yeah.
Stafford stuff affecting Puka Nacua, with Malik Neighbors sitting with, whether it's a toe or a back, with Devon Achane now having some mysterious lower body injury. So it's become a bit trickier, but I think it's still a good spot. And a wide receiver in particular, I really prefer to get one of the elite wide receivers in the first two rounds. And for me, the elite wide receivers go all the way down through the middle of round two in Drake London. Like you were saying, Matt, there's tons of possibilities to get one of those elite wide receivers if you're picking in the back half of round one. I still like Puka Nacua and Malik Neighbors in round one. Then I think Nico Collins, Brian Thomas Jr., A.J. Brown, Drake London, all nice targets inside round two. Again, if you're picking in the back half, easy to get one of those guys. You can even definitely be open to taking two of those guys. It's a bit trickier if you're at the top of the draft. I think in that case, like, again, if Drake London's gone, you could kind of get pushed out of these elite wide receivers if you don't take one in round one. So that's why, again, maybe if you're breaking a tie between, say, a Saquon Barkley and a CD Lamb, it might push me towards CD Lamb just to make sure I get one of those, elite wide receivers.
Yeah, it's been, if I'm in the top five, it's been either Bijan or a wide receiver for me to this point. AJ Brown is somebody that I think is slightly underrated, where he's sliding into a spot in round two that definitely makes him a value. He has scored on the same level, points per game wise, each of the past 3 years. He just dealt with the injury early in the season last year that made the overall numbers look worse. And I think people are overcorrecting for Philly's rushing rate last season, which is probably swinging at least a little bit back toward the pass after being so run heavy last year. So I really like AJ Brown in round two, but I want to make sure that I get one of those high level wide receivers within the first two rounds, maybe two of them, but at least one of them in those first two rounds leaves me feeling most comfortable. Jared, I think that the wide receivers are more attractive than the running backs when we're talking rounds 3, 4 overall. I specifically like Mike Evans, Garrett Wilson, DJ Moore in that range, but just in general, the pool strikes me as better, both there and then especially rounds 5 through 8 even.
Yeah, for me, rounds 5 through 7, that's like the money zone at wide receiver. That's where I want to attack. That's where I want to be in a spot where I can take at least 2, if not 3 wide receivers inside those 3 rounds. So, for me, you have Tet McMillan and Xavier Worthy in round 5. Round 6, Jamison Williams, George Pickens, Zay Flowers, Calvin Ridley, Travis Hunter. I like all those guys in round 6. Round 7, Jalen Waddle, Chris Olave, my 2 favorites. You have Roma Dunze and Debo Samuel there, decent picks there. So, again, that's why I say I'd like to get one of those elites in the first 2 rounds. Then, rounds 3 and 4, you can maybe mix in a running back, consider an elite quarterback, maybe consider George Kittle, who we'll get to when we talk about tight ends here. But again, I like to really fill out my wide receiver core, whether it's my wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, or I think ideally even my wide receiver 3 and wide receiver 4 in those, rounds 5, 6, and 7.
Even guys like Calvin Ridley, Jacoby Myers, though, can be top 3 wide receivers for your team, depending on how things go through those early rounds. But that 5 to 8 range allows me some more flexibility in round 2, 3. If I'm close between a running back and a wide receiver and not sure which way to go, I might lean that running back, or I might feel more comfortable taking Jalen Hurts in round 4 because I know that I'm going to find more options at wideout over the next few rounds. I also think that there's some dead zone potential in the running backs that are going in that round 3 to 5 range. There are some that feel more comfortable than they probably should at this point. And we've seen dead zone years in that range at running back previously. The later targets at wide receiver, I mentioned Jacoby Myers. I think that I expect that he's going to be at least a solid wide receiver 3 for PPR leagues. Then Ricky Pearsall, Keon Coleman, Josh Downs are 3 other guys that I'm going to start out expecting them to be more like wide receiver 4 or 5, but I also think they have the potential to climb into that top 3 wide receiver range for your team.
Yeah, you hit on a lot of the guys I like. You said Ricky Pearsall around 8 or 9. He's a target for me. Emeka Egbuka around 9 or 10 in home league still. I think he's a strong target. And then Keon Coleman around 10 or 11. Rashid Shaheed around 13. Luther Burden around 14. Those are my kind of bench stash wide receivers. And at that point, like, to me, once Burden's off the board, that's when I'm just starting to take stabs at running backs at that point. I'm not really going to mess around with any of those wide receivers. I'd much rather stash a handcuff running back that, again, is just one injury away.
Tight end, how has the production been trending at this position?
Yeah, so at tight end, kind of heading back up, kind of moving the opposite direction of wide receivers, which is interesting. So last year, as a whole, team tight end target share was at its highest level over the last 7 seasons. And tight ends as a whole, looking through tight ends 1 through 13, scored the second most total fantasy points over the past 7 seasons. So again, I think it's been for wide receivers, it's been some of the rushing taking work away, but we've also seen a bit higher percentage of just total passing production going to the tight end position lately.
That range 1 to 13 is key for me in not targeting tight end as early as quarterback. I'm okay with Trey
Yep.
McBride and George Kittle at their draft costs, but I'm just much less likely to target an early tight end than I am an early quarterback and, filling out other positions. I just said I'm fine with the costs on McBride and Kittle specifically, but I'm less fine with the opportunity cost at passing on running back and or wide receiver in that range. I'm a little bit less worried about the dip in production that I expect from George Kittle to like Travis Kelce, David Njoku,
Right.
Evan Engram at tight end.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on these elite tight ends all summer, whether I think they're targets or not, and I've kind of settled on them just being fairly valued. And if you look at our ADP market index, it agrees. We have Brock Bowers consensus ADP 207. That's 2 spots overvalued according to our rankings. Trey McBride's at 303. That's a 1 spot value according to our rankings. And then George Kittle at 404 is perfectly priced according to our ADP market index. So I don't think any of these guys are big values. I also don't think they're bad picks at ADP. You just got to recognize what it's going to do to the rest of your roster if you spend one of your top 4 picks on a tight end. You're going to have to sacrifice at running back or wide receiver, one of those higher end players at those positions. And the other thing I would say, I definitely do not recommend taking both an elite tight end and an elite quarterback. I think that just leaves you too weak at both running back and wide receiver.
Unless you're in an 8-team league, then you can do it. Or if you're
Sure.
in a 10-team league, depending on how things settle out, because the smaller the league, the more advantage you get from those one starter positions. But
Yep.
but I agree with that. And you mentioned them being fairly valued. And if we look at running back and wide receiver, and you're like, this guy is appropriately valued, I'm like, cool, I'll go ahead and take him. For me though, at tight end, it's like if that guy's appropriately valued, that's kind of a reason to pass on him, because if I look down below him, I see
Yep.
6 guys that are values according to ADP market index.
Yeah, and you nailed it with the opportunity cost too. Like my issue with Bowers going in the middle of round 2 is you might have to take him over a Jonathan Taylor or an AJ Brown or a Drake London. I can't get there. It's when he gets past those guys into like the end of round 2. That's where I like taking Brock Bowers. Trey McBride's easier to take in early round 3. I think T Higgins is someone that sticks out as someone you might have to take Trey McBride over, but he's definitely a tier below the AJ Brown, Drake London, Jonathan Taylor tier. And then George Kittle's the easiest one to take because we talked about round 4 to me being pretty shaky at both running back and wide receiver. Like, it's kind of Ken Walker, Alvin Kamara at running back. I'm considering in that range, maybe Mike Evans, Jackson Smith and Jigba at wide receiver, but it's easier to take George Kittle over those guys.
Yeah, I mentioned some of the names that you can wait a little bit longer on. Travis Kelce, David Njoku. We talk about plenty. If you don't know that we like David
Yep.
Njoku, this is your first time watching a show, and in which case, thank you for joining us. Feel free to say hi in the comments below. Evan Engram, another guy I know I like better than you do, but Dalton Kincaid is a pretty easy target. We have him ranked higher than the market does, and really, he's a fairly safe bet for targets and production for PPR at the very least, as long as he stays healthy. This is also a position where even if a guy doesn't work out, probably not going to be all that difficult to find a replacement. And even Dallas Goedert, Jared, is somebody that I've found myself coming around on, realizing how well he has produced over the past few years. Like, he has missed time with injuries pretty much every year, but when he's on the field, he's a near guarantee for top 10 level production across formats.
Yeah, very condensed passing game in Philly. It's just Goddard, the 2 wide receivers, and then obviously Saquon Barkley. And then the nice thing with Goddard is if either of those wide receivers get hurt, we've seen him be like a top 5 fantasy tight end in that case. So I like Goddard. My strategy at tight end is, consider one of those elites, especially if they drop past ADP. If I don't get them, hopefully get David Njoku, who is still going like round 8, I think, in ADP. If I don't get an elite or Njoku, I like pairing one of the rookie tight ends with a stable veteran. So we have Tyler Warren and Colson Loveland both going round 9 now. I know you look at our ADP market index and we have them both overvalued there, but I still think the upside is enticing enough for a round 9 pick. If I can pair them with a Jake Ferguson in round 11, Dalton Kincaid in round 12, Dallas Goedert in round 13, I'm probably opening the season starting one of those, more stable veterans, but then also having that rookie upside on my bench that, if things break right, those guys can be top 8 tight ends.
I think Tyler Warren, especially, I expect him to be a fairly high floor guy. We'll see about the quarterback in Indy, but it sounds like he's on track to get lots of targets, could even lead that team in targets the way that he's being talked about in summer practices so far. But yeah, I think that those guys are fine. I don't know what to make of Colson Loveland or the Bears offense yet, but I can't
Yep.
argue against him at that round 9 range. I think though, if you do take somebody like that, that you're still kind of playing wait and see on, you could even wait a little bit longer to get the insurance tight end. And we've got Kyle Pitts out there. We've got Zach Ertz, Hunter Henry, Chigakonkwo, Mike Gesicki, Brenton Strange. I think, none of those guys is especially exciting, but any of those guys could, sneak into the bottom of tight end 1 range by the end of the season and be a
Yep.
nice insurance, even if it's just a week to week starting option for you.
For sure. Yeah. I think Zach Ertz and Hunter Henry are 2 later round guys you could pair with one of those rookies. I think, both Ertz and Henry are going to be fine early season fantasy starters for you. Pitts, for me, would be more of a guy to pair with like Jake Ferguson. Like Pitts is someone I would not want to rely on early in the season as a starter, but theoretically might still have upside. I don't know. And then, yeah, I mean, Chigakonkwo, we got to mention Chigakonkwo. He's still my favorite, like, deep sleeper at the position. Encouraging camp for him, encouraging preseason usage. Just a passing game I think is going to be better this year with the legit NFL quarterback under center. And then the wide receiver core, there's still really nothing there besides Calvin Ridley. So there's definitely room for Chigakonkwo to carve out a pretty big role in that passing game.
And every single year includes some surprise or two at tight end, guys that are drafted way beyond that wind up inside the top 12. So if you do just want to wait forever on tight end, feel free to wait late in your draft, scoop up value at other positions, and then get any 2 of those guys and see how things work out.
Yeah, I'd even throw out, like, if you're in a super deep league, I think Jatavian Sanders, Jawan Johnson, Theo Johnson. I think those guys are just going to be on the field for their teams a lot. So again, if you are maybe collecting 3 late tight ends, even those are 3 super late options I would consider.
You can find the updated draft guide for your format right now on draftsharks.com. 12 team for PPR, half PPR, non PPR. We've got 10 team versions for all 3 of those as well. We've got 8 team, 14 team, 16 team draft strategies. We've got a Superflex draft strategy article up there. So go find it. It's out there. And sync your league today at draftsharks.com. You can practice drafting with all of the specific settings of your league, scoring and roster settings that match what you're actually going to play, your exact draft position, format specific ADP as you do your mock drafts. It's what you need to get ready for the real thing, which is on the doorstep. It's time. Get in. Make sure that Draft Sharks is your unfair advantage.